We are now live on the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on another edition of the most powerful platform for truth. But today we have an excellent and special guest for you guys. I've been wanting to get this guy on the platform for a while, and I finally got him. Journalist Mr. John Helmer. How's it going today, Mr. Helmer?
Thank you very much for having me, Rashid. Thank you.
No, thank you for being here because I want to pick your mind for a minute.
Okay.
The first question that we can get into is, and I know you're in Russia, from your perspective and from your viewpoint, what is going on with the U.S. administration? It seems like that every move that they're making to try to forestall the fall of empire is only accelerating the fall of empire.
Well, now that's a big question. Let's start with the breaking news, so to speak. Scott Bessent has just made a press conference on the conclusion of his talks with the Chinese negotiators, He Lifeng and Li Chenggang, and that tells us a bit about how they think. They think the U.S., the Trump administration, clearly thinks from Bessent's calculations, and he calculates how much oil will be missing from the market if the Hormuz Strait stays closed. We can take that as a kind of indicator of how long the Trump administration thinks the war will last. It seems they think the war will last another 10 days. 10 to 14 days is what Bessent calculates will be the time needed to consume the available surplus of oil outside the Hormuz Strait without any significant additions through the Hormuz Strait for the international market, based on allowing sanctions waivers for people, countries to buy Russian oil afloat, Iranian oil afloat, that's Iranian oil in storage, and a Russian oil in storage in tankers abroad. So we can start with the idea that the US thinks this is a short war. Well, it's not exactly short. 10 more days plus 17 is 27. It's a month-long war, first. Second, if the Trump administration thinks it's short, they already have an idea, as is often speculated in the press at the moment, of declaring victory and sailing away. That's not the Israeli position. And as you may know, in today's Dances with Bears, I wanted to surface the possibility that the Israelis, if they fail to achieve their war aims, their principal war aim is to destroy Iran. It's a kind of genocidal aim to destroy Iran's capacity to ever fire a significant missile barrage against Israel again, or for the foreseeable future. If Israel faces that prospect, that Iran emerges from the next 10 days, its missile capacity is intact, its capacity to hit with relative precision Israel loses this war. The US may think it can walk away from a short war and keep the empire intact. And arguably, they're not wrong about that. We'll come to why they're not wrong, or why they think they're not wrong in a minute. But if Israel loses the war by leaving Iran intact, not just the regime, not just the government, not just popular support, but the military capacities of Iran intact, does Israel have the motive and the capacity and the sense of freedom of action or self-superiority? Does Israel go nuclear? Does Israel attack Iran with nuclear weapons at the end of this so-called 10 days more % estimate for the war? So if Israel goes nuclear, or is planning to do, what's the US, what's the Trump administration policy? What's the Trump administration intention to either stop Israel or curb Israel or threaten Israel or simply allow Israel to achieve a genocidal nuclear attack against Iran, the way the US has allowed Israel to achieve genocide in Gaza? I think they're the most pressing issues. On the bigger one, how's the US empire going? I think although they aren't saying it exactly, the empire's not doing too badly. Why? Because from a US point of view, it's achieving on the, let's call it the sidelines of the war, Chinese compliance, Russian compliance, and Indian compliance with what the US aims to do. And it, from a Trump point of view, personally, and in his circle, I think the US side, I'm sorry if it disappoints our audience, but we'll get to trying to heal that disappointment a bit later. BRICS is finished, and so is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, finished. Dead as a doorknob. Why? Because India broke at the beginning with this extraordinary speech by Prime Minister Modi in the Israeli Knesset, screaming, Am Yisrael Chai, which is an Israeli war crime, and a war cry. India supported this war. India, or at least the Modi government, supported the US-Israeli war to destroy Iran. First, they're trying to repair the damage of their mistake now, but that's different. Second, China has now apparently agreed to postponing Trump's summit visit in a couple of weeks' time. It's trying to heal the impression that it put the US first ahead of its support for Iran, and its military intelligence and other support for Iran to continue to survive. That's in doubt. In doubt. So China would be, from a US point of view, increasingly compliant, or more compliant than the US figured. So you've got India and China, the pillars of BRICS, breaking in the direction of the empire, trying to make bilateral deals with Trump. From a Trump point of view, he wins whatever the outcome of the Iran war. In Russia's case, it's a winner in the short term because of the revenue increases from the spiking price of oil. The price of Urals blend Russian oil now in India is on paper almost $99. The discount that Russian trade has had to pay to deliver Urals oil or Russian oil has all but disappeared. There's a premium now. So from a revenue point of view, Russia's winning. Also, factional terms in Moscow, there's been no discredit for the US negotiators that ran the deception operation before the war began, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. No discredit in Russia for talking to them. No backlash, if you like, on the part of the Russian government that those two negotiators can never be trusted. So what's happened is that President Putin's emissary, Kirill Dmitriev, went to Miami last week and negotiated directly with Witkoff and Kushner. And so what's emerged from that, Dmitriev keeps pumping up tweets every hour or so, is the notion that, factionally speaking, in Russia, Europe First faction, led by Dmitriev, supported by the central bank governor and so on, have achieved, they think, a short-term objective, which is to persuade Europe to come back to Russia, to start normalizing relations with Russia, to drop the sanctions with Russia. That was expressed by the Belgian Prime Minister in the last day or so. And from a Russian point of view, the war is is playing into Russia's hands. First, by encouraging Europe to reconsider its war against Russia, and second, giving time to the general staff to prosecute the war on the front, giving them more time to advance as they are advancing slowly, and dropping the negotiations for so-called peace with Ukraine, and reducing the pressure on Russia to make any form of concessions on the battlefield while the battlefield goes west. So from Russian point of view, it's preparing its bilateral deal with the Trump administration. So the Trump administration, I think, feels that it's also got Russia under control. So to try to sum up here, who's winners, who are winning, who are losing, it seems to me that from a Trump administration point of view, it's a win because they've just seriously damaged Iran. Even if US bases are seriously damaged, the US can count on the major pillars of BRICS as an alternative, multipolar alternative to the United States empire. The US can say, no, that's not what's happening. Russia, China, and India are still dependent on us. They're still keen to preserve the petrodollar. They're not going to make a significant alliance against us. That's not a, let's call it a win-win in the Trump sense, but it's the empire is preserved. Iran takes terrible losses, yes, but it is winning its war against the alliance by surviving and preserving its military capacities and threatening for the first time the stability of the Arab monarchies against Iran, allied with the US. Iran wins in many respects, but we can come back to whether it gains its negotiating objectives for the war in a minute. Israel loses in every way. Israel has had its military capacities seriously compromised, damaged, destroyed, no matter how much they hide that. Second, its economy seriously destroyed. Third, its reliance on US protection is damaged by the capacity of the Iranians to break through American protection, Israeli protection. Israel is vulnerable strategically now in a way that was first tested and demonstrated by Hamas, but this time it's demonstrated much more fundamentally, and that's the risk, that Israel is the biggest loser of this war, attempts to recoup by going nuclear.
So here are two questions I need to ask you before we go further.
Sure.
Where did the Quds Force General betray the IRGC, and where is Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, let's take that last question. Where is the Prime Minister of Israel? I spent a few hours trying to figure out, just like everybody else, why the Prime Minister in charge of the state prosecuting a war can disappear from normal, regular intercourse with his ministers and experts and military commanders in the prosecution of the war. Where is Netanyahu? I really have reached only a few conclusions. But first, he probably still has 5 fingers on each of his hands. Second, he is not appearing in the normal fashion. And third, the attempts the Israelis have made to show Netanyahu alive, well, and speaking, the first with the so-called 6-fingered speech, which it clearly looks an AI-generated fabrication, can't really be repaired by the coffee shop a video. When you look carefully at that, you can see he thinks, and the mainstream press supporting Israel thinks, he has humorously disabused the notion that he's dead, wounded, or otherwise out of action. You look at, for example, the level of the coffee in the cup seems to be the same after he's taken a sip of it. That's peculiar. Second, you watch him in the video drinking coffee, but you don't watch him swallowing. Between the sipping and the next bit, you can see there's been a cut in the video. These are sorts of indicators of heavy editing, of AI fabrication. Why? And anyway, why does and this is a more important point than that particular video. In answer to your question, Rashid, where's Netanyahu? He must prove he's alive. He must prove he's mentally competent. He must prove he's running the war that he and Israel began with the United States. So you don't go to a coffee shop and demonstrate you're the prime minister of a war-making a country in this present position. The fact that they did that indicates there is something profoundly wrong with Netanyahu at the moment. Have his own military locked him up in case, for example, they think he's becoming unhinged and likely to order a launch of nuclear weapons. It is possible in Israel with their mentality, their religious conviction that they are superior beings, superior morally, superior militarily, superior racially. In Israel, the mentality is suffering. And it's possible that Netanyahu could be the subject of a kind of military putsch. It's possible. It's inconceivable until now. But the man is missing in action. And I emphasize in action. He can't demonstrate more than he can lift a cup of coffee and show his two hands. And it looks as if that's fabricated to pass the message, in my opinion. In answer to your question, he's failing to show where he is. And he's failing to show he's in charge. He's failing to show he's prime minister in power. All of those things compound the weakness and therefore compound the rumors. And they don't seem to have a solution to the rumors. They've got PR instead. I think I've answered the second question, but I kind of forgotten what the first one was.
Did the head of the Al-Quds force in Iran betray the IRGC and the Ayatollah?
You got me here as a Russia correspondent, and
I told you I was going to get you like this first.
I don't know the answer. I've seen the speculation. The man who wasn't there several times lucky when the Israelis attacked. I've no reason to believe the reports that there has been within the IRGC a high-level mole. On the other hand, I can tell you from the Russian reporting, some of which I translated and published last week, by a journalist called Yevgeny Krytkov. Krytkov used to be in Russian military intelligence. He has good military intelligence sources, and he analyzed what, let's say, the meaning of the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei amounted to. And he came to some conclusions about the relative lack of internal security that's been characteristic of the Iranian leadership before the June War and since the June War. He didn't disclose any significant news to answer your question, but has there been a high enough level tip-off to the CIA, which is what Kritikov thought rather than to the Mossad, that enabled the attack on Khamenei to pinpoint his exact location at the exact time. I don't know the answer to that. Therefore, I don't know the answer to your question. Was the, let's say, pinpoint source a maid, a driver, a chauffeur of some kind, a cleaner, anyone in a position to know exact location, exact time to enable the attack on Khamenei? I don't know the answer. I'm inclined to think that the accusations about a high-level mold in the IRGC is information warfare. My inclination would be to believe, as the Kritikov piece indicated, that the tip-off on exact location, exact timing came from a low-level person in a position to know, either a driver or a bodyguard or a cleaner, and so on.
Okay, so now we get to what your expertise really is, Russia. Why hasn't Russia struck NATO territory for all of the provocations and the direct assaults on Russian territory? And because it seems like to me Russia is allowing the U.S. and NATO to continue to do this, and I don't think that maybe the government understands that the more you allow the U.S. government to take, the more they will take.
That's the profound strategic point, and it's the point on which there's a significant political conflict or political faction fight, and there has been for many years in Russia. Let's call it, there's a Europe first faction, and then there's a military faction, and put this, let me explain the factional lineup, and then we put it on the clock. The fact is that in politics and in life, everybody has a short term, a medium term, and a long term. Some of us, like me, don't have a long term. Therefore, you've got to put factional differences in assessment on the clock and figure out what's in your best interest in the short term, medium term, long term. On the one hand, I mentioned already, you have a faction presented publicly by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian direct investment fund, a sovereign wealth investment fund, representing, pardon me, a Europe first orientation. If you're Europe first, if you want Russia to be aligned with Europe, starting with the doctrine of Russia-German partnership, with which President Putin worked with Chancellor Merkel for the first 10 years of his term. If you've got a Europe first orientation, you don't attack NATO, no matter what their provocations are. Pardon me. You've had warnings from President Putin, repeated warnings against the readiness of the European states, Romania, Poland, to allow a dual-capable, nuclear-capable missile installations on their territory. You've had warnings from President Putin for many, many years that the Europeans were allowing themselves to be mobilized by the United States into an anti-Russian coalition. There's a long history to that. And despite all the evidence and despite all the red line drawing on the part of President Putin, the Europeans individually, Germany, France, pardon me, the UK, Italy, and so on, have not been deterred from militarizing their economies, allying more and more with the United States in a war against Russia. So the European consensus to weaken Russia, destroy Russia, break up Russia using the Ukrainian battlefield. That European consensus hasn't been broken yet. And yet the factional alignment in Moscow remains strongly committed to restoring the relationship with Europe. And so you see Dmitriev tweeting every hour, this is our moment. This is the moment when the Europeans will come to their senses. A few Baltic states, a few European Union officials will stick to the anti-Russian line, but this faction in Moscow goes on believing Europe first. They are not ready to embrace multipolarity with allies like China, India, the African states, the American states, and so on. They don't want it that way. Their economic prosperity, their wealth, the education of their children, their sense of their short and medium term has always been Europe-oriented, United States-oriented. They want to be loved by the United States. They want to be loved by the Italians, the French, and the British. They've demonstrated that ever since the fall of Mikhail Gorbachev, and it included Gorbachev and his own wife. They want to be loved by the West, by the white West, okay? So that faction hasn't lost power, and you can, in answer to your question, expect them to oppose any military action that directly attacks NATO or NATO territory, even when the evidence is in Romania or Poland, direct intervention by those states across the borders, allowing those states to represent both potential nuclear and current conventional threats to Russian forces in the Ukraine. So an attack on a NATO state is politically impossible. Yes, when last week a French and British missile or group of missiles, I haven't got the exact details, struck and killed Russian citizens in a border region, the foreign ministry called in the ambassadors for the UK and France and gave them a dressing down that your countries are engaged in direct war with us. That's the limit. That's the limit of the, as it were, strategic opposition to NATO. On the battlefield, however, the General Staff, the Defense Ministry, the intelligence services understand, just as you said, that this is a war against the NATO alliance, the NATO allies, their staffs, their technical people, their soldiers are on the battlefield and their targets. So for the time being, and since the war began 2022, Russia's constrained itself to hitting NATO, French, British, Italian, and others, regulars or contract employees on the battlefield in the Ukraine. And there is a military faction, military intelligence faction in Moscow that thinks it needs to rebuild its military capacities to face NATO as it reinforces against Russia, not only on the Ukraine battlefield, but northwards from Poland through the Baltic states, Finland, and across the Arctic Circle. So there is a military faction that wants, in the short term, to strike as hard as possible against NATO, expose their military weaknesses on the battlefield in the Ukraine, and buy some time to begin to rebuild Russia's capacities along the full length of the northern front and along the Arctic front. That, they think, takes time and money. The money's not available. Money's scarce in the domestic budget. So Putin is a balancer. President Putin is not a political strategist. I try to emphasize he's got many qualities, one of which is an extraordinary memory, but he's a political balancer. To some people, that's vacillation and weakness. To him and within the political battlefield inside the Kremlin, it's a balancing act that requires constant combat to test which way Putin will go on which issue. Balancing is weakness because, just as you said, Rashid, and you said it right, if you don't deter the United States, they move forward. There's no point, and this has been a significant outcome of the war today. There is no point in relying on US agreements. Their words are worthless. The foreign minister said this in the argument over what's Trump's words at Anchorage, Alaska worth from last year. To many factionally in Moscow, the answer's worthless. Only force will work. Only force deters. And so you've got a balance, and Putin half says that, half doesn't say it. That means half encourages the United States to test him. It means half loses the capacity to deter. The capacity to deter, let's look at that. You don't have to strike a NATO capital with an Oreshnik missile to deter further US or NATO advances on the battlefield. Did the Russian side, did the Chinese side deter the Americans and the Israelis from attacking Iran before it happened? Did they issue deterrent quality statements backed up by the capacity to defend and deter? They didn't. After the event, they, both Russia and China, have said what they've said. We can get into that later. But I think the answer to your question is basically a political one, and an understanding that President Putin balances the domestic political forces in his short-term, medium-term calculations, and they include Russian elections. They include costs. They include Russian casualties. So before we can jump on and criticize President Putin for balancing, for compromising, for appearing to vacillate, one has to do the political calculations from his point of view. He faces a midterm election test in September, like Trump will face in November. He faces a range of business lobbying that fights the high level of central bank interest rates. He fights the problem that Russia is fighting this war with poor men. The poorest of Russian regions are supplying most of the manpower for the Russian army to fight in the Ukraine. President Putin attempted a mobilization that affected all the wealthier regions of Russia, particularly St. Petersburg and Moscow. And that attempted mobilization generated an exodus. It generated a lot of political pushback. In an election year in Russia, like everywhere else, you do not impose higher costs, fuel costs, risk of life costs on your population. So President Putin has to be understood as balancing war to defend Russia short of deterring the enemy. The deterrence has failed. It failed in Syria, it failed in Libya, it failed in the Middle East, it failed in Iran, but it isn't quite failing on Russia's borders. Okay, but at the same time, he cannot generate enough manpower to accelerate the advance of the army across the Ukraine. When you look carefully at the way the war's being fought, when you look carefully at the casualty cost on the Russian side, you get some sense of the balancing effect. President Putin is trying to fight a major war, at the same time make Moscow, St. Petersburg, and his constituents feel life's normal, business as usual. And you get a lot of podcasters from the United States invited to Moscow who come back astounded or tell the audience, your audience, this audience, how normal things are in Moscow. Well, that's an achievement of what might be called President Putin's vacillation. You might call it vacillation, you might call it weakness, you might call it balancing. But that normality of the economy, that presentation of well-being, that masks decisions not to widen the war against NATO by striking it and outside the battlefield. It masks the slowness of the advance, the length of time it takes deliberately to prepare offensives at the tactical level in order to minimize Russian casualties. All of those factors you have to see politically, as you would in the United States, as people do in the United States. I hope that's a bit long-winded, but I'm trying to say you can understand the Russian position if you understand how the balancing act works in Washington. It's not different.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this can go on in perpetuity, especially with the constant level of provocations, the using of storm shadows to strike apartment buildings and schools? And I know that, like you said, it works the same way in Russia as in the United States with the politics. I know that the people should be crying out, hey, let's end this war. Let's just go in and there has to be a portion of the population saying, listen, we have to teach them a lesson, because I know some of the people want to be reintegrated into the West, but they have to understand that the West has not accepted them for hundreds of years and would never accept them as equals, and really wants to break up the Russian Federation.
You're quite right there, Rashid. There is a strong public opinion, Russian public opinion, that shows in the polls that, and I try to report them when they come up. Yes, there is that view. Yes, it leads to the view, if you and some of the opinion poll companies have put people in focus groups and given them open-ended questions. So they ask your question. What do you think is the best way forward here? And the majority opinion is we favor negotiations. But if negotiations fail, if they fail to achieve the objectives we seek, which is long-term security for Russia, if the negotiations fail, let's maximize our effort to destroy the enemy's capacity to threaten us. So it's either negotiations or finish of the job. Now, that's a kind of decision fork in the road for the politicians, for the military staffs, for the budget to debate. And there's been no loss of confidence in President Putin's balancing act, so long as the army convinces the public that the cost in casualties, the cost in money, the cost in tax is more than offset by their victories on the battlefield. So support for Putin is correlated with support for the Russian army. That correlation is very strong, but it's a correlation. Were the battle tide on the battlefield to weaken, so would support for President Putin. And we'll have to see when we come up to the elections of September how Russian voters vote for domestic reasons, in relation to the cost of living, in relation to the future of their children, in relation to the risk of military mobilization, and in the risks of the kind of pressures you just talked about. People assess their own short and medium-term future. Is Russia in perpetuity? You used the word. In perpetuity at risk? Yes. Yes. Do Russians understand and accept that there's a race hatred for Slavs, that there's a race hatred for Russians of the German kind? I don't just say Hitler kind, German kind. Chancellor Merz represents German race hatred for Russia in no differently from the way Adolf Hitler did. There is racism against Russians. Do Russians accept there is racist hatred for them in Europe? No, they don't. They're surprised by it. First, normal people, middle-income people, tourists are surprised by the hatred, the antagonism that they run into in countries like Denmark and Norway. On the other hand, the very wealthy Russian, the oligarch class, the business level class, believes, and you just have to go to a Russian restaurant in London to see it, believes that money buys security. Money buys love. Their money, safely stashed away in British real estate or French real estate, can buy their security. They believed it until the war began. They'd like to recover it. There are class differences among Russians. So there are class differences in the way they perceive their treatment. Is there an underlying Russian anti-imperialist view? Not anymore. No, there was, but the education of the Soviet period, of the Bolshevik period, has been lost, definitively lost, difficult to recover, and it's dying out. So anti-imperialism as a Russian sentiment, I'd have to say, is dying out, even though Russia is now fighting a major war against the empire. It's very difficult to find anti-imperialist theory, anti-imperialist sentiment among Russian people.
How long can the negotiations go on? Because we've heard this, the foreign ministry say that America is agreement incapable. We've heard the president of the Russian Federation say the same thing, and even go as far, Vladimir Putin went as far as to say that America does not accept equals or allies, only vassalage. So what I'm saying is, unless you're willing to become a vassal state, what good is the negotiations? We've seen when Gaddafi negotiated, what happened to him. We saw what happened to Saddam when he negotiated. We saw what happened to Assad when he negotiated. We saw what happened in Iran. Both times they negotiated. And now we see that every time Russia negotiates, America in the West covertly helps Ukraine to strike civilian targets or to strike Russia's radars or Russia's nuclear component. The escalation continues to go up. So when does it become feasible for the leadership to say, hey, this will be our method of the negotiation. We'll strike them as they strike us?
You put it very well. I can't put it differently, Rashid. You put it reasonably. You could have added that President Putin has been targeted at probably twice by a combination of US, UK, and Ukrainian drone strikes. the last of them relatively recently against his residents in the Northwest. And yet he doesn't react, as you might think, with the credibility of deterrence. Why is that? Answer: short-term politics dictate short-term outcomes, short-term solutions, because politics is about the short-term, preserving power till the next election and beyond. And President Putin faces not only a midterm this year, but a succession arrangement if he decides not to run for another term in 2030. So between now and then, you have calculations of preserving your power, preserving your wealth, preserving what you have for at least your children's generation. This is a preoccupation. For the moment, however, thinking purely militarily and politically, all the negotiations between the Russian side with a so-called mediation of Kushner and Vitkov are off. They're off. They're temporarily disconnected and postponed while the US tries to wage its war against Iran. That would tend to encourage, wouldn't it, Russian support for Iran to keep the war as damaging for the US and Israeli side, at least in secret, and make sure that Iran can continue to prosecute its war for as long as Iran determines it needs. In other words, you would think that from a military strategy point of view, Russian strategy ought to be to weaken the United States on as many fronts as the United States aim to weaken Russia on as many fronts. Yes, you would think that would be the Russian strategy, and maybe it is, but President Putin's not going to say it. He's going to say, we're ready to negotiate a modus vivendi with Trump, and the real reason for that is that from a Russian point of view, Trump is a better opportunity than Biden was, than Hillary Clinton was, that Obama was. In other words, from a Russian point of view, the Democratic alternative to Trump is probably worse for Russia than Trump himself. You think that's wrong from where you're sitting?
I think it is, because it doesn't matter which president is in, you have a deep state that controls policy, and yes, anything that Trump agrees to right now, the next one could disagree with when he comes, or he or she comes into office. So to place all of your eggs in that basket, risking all of them getting smashed and crushed. And Russia should, as a great power, should display itself as a great power that it is, and stop dithering. I don't think the Russian people understand this mindset. I'm here. My parents, grandparents were up from slavery, so I can say this. America understands one language. And so if you and I are talking, Mr. Helmer, and I'm speaking Chinese, and you're speaking Russian, and I refuse to learn Russian, the only way that you can convey your message to me is to learn Chinese. Well, Russia has been trying to speak the language of diplomacy to the West ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So yes, it seems like that America does not understand the language of diplomacy, but we can look at her actions and her policies and everything that she sets out, and we do understand one language that she understands: force.
Yes.
And yes, sometimes you have to be forceful to get the attention of someone, to let them know, hey, no more. Don't step over this line, or else these are the consequences. When you're dealing with an irrational person and they're frantic, and you're trying to talk to them, they don't understand you unless you smack them and calm them down. And I think we're at that moment in time that Russia needs to start considering the smackdown.
You put it very well, Rashid. I would say in my lifetime, my career, I've seen most of the countries in which I've worked, Australia, Greece, Sri Lanka, the Arab states, fail to understand the Achilles heel advantage that weak states have facing powerful states. Iran, for the first time, is showing it understands how a weak state can fight back if it understands the Achilles heel. That's the vulnerable point of the strong empire that's fighting them, aiming to destroy them. Since I came to Russia in 1989, I can say that it's very, very difficult for Russians to accept that they've been the victims. It is increasingly obvious that they have been, but not sufficiently, I should say, that the doctrine of the weak state exploiting the Achilles heel of the strong state becomes a war-fighting doctrine. And you can see many of the bloggers or podcasters who support Russia in this war insist on the superiority of Russian arms, the superiority of the Russian performance on the battlefield. All of that's true and demonstrably true, but at considerable costs, which the Russian people are reluctant to go on paying. When you're a weak state and you're existentially threatened, you look for the Achilles heel of your attacker. And Iran is demonstrating that capacity while taking immense losses in leadership, losses in the blood of civilians, the losses of industrial and cultural monuments, industrial capacity, cultural monuments, and so on. Weak states rarely, very rarely demonstrate what Iran is demonstrating now. But that lesson is difficult for Russians who believe, pardon me, that they had built up since the revolution the capacity to advance and protect their interests and deter. That was lost during the 1980s. Gorbachev compounded it by accepting a kind of level of, quotes, coexistence that was, I think you could rightly say, vassalage, yes, in return for what he thought, and then Yeltsin even more thought, was what Russian people wanted. Now the price for wanting that, quotes, a relationship with the West is, as you've just explained it, a perpetual risk of being broken up and destroyed piece by piece. That lesson has gotten through, and what are we in now? 2026 since 1990. That's 36 years. It's a whole generation of learning. But the older generation understands the lesson you just spelled out. The younger generation, not the generation that didn't read Marx, Stalin, and Lenin, that didn't believe that the Soviet Union or Russia is surrounded by enemies. The new generation has wanted to be westernized, has wanted the freedom to travel, the freedom to be, quotes, normal, the freedom to go to American movies, etc., etc. That culture is not my generation, but it's a powerful achievement on the part of the US, principally, but also the European states, to persuade the younger Russian generation that they could, as it were, abandon the country. Now the country, under attack, has had to relearn old lessons, not Communist Party lessons, Russian imperial lessons they've had to relearn. But learning in that generation is much slower. It's a slow learning process. And there's not enough time for slow learners when you're under attack. So yes, force is the only method of persuasion when you come to war of the kinds that Russia is facing, and not only on the Ukrainian battlefield. Iran is showing how the weak can win a war, but take punishment, loss of a very great kind. Russia suffered that loss in the past and remembers that loss all the time and is ready to fight. But in the short term, the cost of fighting versus the cost of a normal life gets weighed, and people opt for the normal life if they can, for as long as they can. And they want a president who can deliver that with the least cost on the battlefield. So what you're saying, that force is the only language to deal with the United States, is the view of the General Staff. It's the view of the intelligence agencies. It's probably the majority view in the Security Council, the principal collective decision-making organ, platform for warfighting. But President Putin has to balance that against the younger generation's aspirations in order to preserve domestic stability. So you've got to wage a war. You've got to wage a war on many fronts. And you've got to balance that in the ways we've said. So when you balance, you end up with compromise. And when you end up with compromise, you see the US and your enemies exploiting your compromise and cutting through. They see the Russian Achilles heel. The Russians have lost the capacity to strike at their Achilles heel. Iran is a wake-up call for Russia. It's a wake-up call. But if you look at the Russian press, you ask your sources involved in decision-making, to what extent is the Iranian wake-up call, the Achilles heel strategy, accepted as warfighting doctrine on the Russian side? And I'd say undecided, still in motion.
In closing, two questions left for you. Is there strong debate, and I heard you say that there are arguments in the Security Council about the use of force or whatever like that. Do you know the composition of those who really want to show America that they are not a vassal, and the ones that are trying to just balance and lean towards the West?
You want me to tell you the score of the game before the game's over? Is that
I was trying to get it out of you.
Well, no, it's a fair question, but it's a betting question, isn't it? It's a betting question. As I said, what's the view inside the Security Council that it is in Russia's strategic interest not just to prevent a US-driven takeover of Iran, which would create a massive strategic danger on Russia's southern flank, as the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan already is. Yeah, Russia's already fought a little war on its southern flank. That was the war against US-driven Georgia in 2008. It understands the serious cost of a US campaign to build up Azerbaijan and Armenia and a regime changed Iran on the southern flank. It understands that. Therefore, you're asking me, how much would the Security Council agree to support Iran to hit back for as long as possible, close the Hormuz Strait, impose the highest economic costs on the rest of the world, and do that as discreetly as possible? And if it's to be secret, how to camouflage it? Okay, well, the camouflage was put in place last week. Humanitarian flights carrying medicines, hospital equipment, all the things the United States and Israel are attacking and destroying in Iran are now being flown into Iran on Russian aircraft. Okay, the humanitarian resupply has apparently been negotiated in principle when President Putin and President Trump had the telephone call that Trump initiated a few days back. Okay, is that a camouflage as well for Russian resupply? On that issue, the president's spokesman said, Iran hasn't asked, so we're not delivering. So let's just say the answer to your question is, it's accepted, yes. It's obvious because it's true that Russia needs the security of a friendly Iranian state on its southern border, as it needs North Korea friendly, China friendly on its eastern border, and it needs to guard against the advance of the United States and the NATO enemies on the Arctic front from Greenland over to Canada. Yes, it needs all of that. Therefore, is there underneath it a Russian support for Iran? Yes. How military that is remains secret, because in the balancing act Putin has to conduct in relation to the United States, there is the Europe first, US first faction of Dmitriev and the others who think they've made their deal with Witkoff, Kushner, and the Trump family. They think they will get relief of sanctions. Well, Dmitriev thinks that last week he persuaded the United States to provide this sanctions waiver for a few days, a month. When Besant was asked earlier today in Paris, will the sanctions relief for Russia extend beyond April 12, when it's scheduled to expire, as some of the European warfighters want it to expire? Besant avoided answering the question. So you have right now two lines of Russian action. So the Achilles heel strategy of encouraging Iran to hit at the vulnerabilities that are anti-Russian, and you have camouflage, secret, not discussed, assumed. People, if our audience wants to be wishful in thinking, I don't know that they'll come to you, Rashid, or me to support their wishful thinking. You asked me to bet on a game. Yeah, what's the score at the end of the game? I know a lot of our audience think that what we're doing here is a game in which they want their side to win by as many goals as points as possible. Whether our audience is willing to bet real money on their wishful thinking, I don't know. But in politics, in Moscow as everywhere else, not too many people are willing to bet on wishful thinking. What you bet on is a game you can rig. Now, you told me, you're right, force is the only game winner that you can rely on. Okay, you said that, and I agree, and there isn't a Russian disagreement in the Security Council. But there are Russians outside the Security Council, around the president, inside the Kremlin wall, who say, yeah, I've rigged the game with Trump. Trump's our opportunity. We can bribe that guy. We can bribe Kushner. We can bribe Witkoff's sons. We've got all the methods we know. We're experts at bribery. We're experts at crypto transfers. We're experts at hiding stolen money. Let's take the opportunity in dealing with that lot, because we couldn't do it with the Biden law. So we can't dispute. There are others watching this game who think they can rig the outcome for their private pocket. And they are let's call them the money game riggers versus the force game riggers. Now, if our audience sitting there at home wants to bet, how do you bet between the force game rigging and the money game rigging? Do you want to bet between the two? Or would you prefer a podcaster who tells you, oh, no, it's going to be this way or that way? Russia has such dominant force, you can bet on the outcome. Russia wins. Or somebody else who will tell you, the petrodollar's finished. We're going to have a BRICS multipolar currency economy in which the US empire is finished. You want to bet on that? I understand how the podcast universe carries on the wishful thinking about the answer to your question, Rashid. And I'm not trying to duck the question. I'm simply saying betting money against guns isn't a very good bet. Betting guns against money isn't a very good bet either. The best way of betting is rigging the game. If rigging the game can't be managed medium term, long term, how can you rig it in the short term? I don't know how to rig the game in the short term. My job's to persuade people to take a look at the way these games are being rigged before you put any money, wishful thinking, guns, your children's lives at risk. That's my job. That's a journalist's job. That's a truth teller's job, as distinct from an investment in wishful thinking or going short on the dollar or going long on oil or going long on the Russian army. I don't bet. I mean, I've had enough betting and I've lost enough bets in my life. I figure being a journalist is risking just about everything, right?
Yes.
Except wishful thinking. I don't bet wishes. That seems to me a sign of insanity.
Last question. Was Gorbachev and Yeltsin CIA assets?
Well, hold on. Let's put it this way. It's easy to see the outcome, the disastrous, catastrophic outcomes of their decisions as so beneficial to the United States. You infer that they must have understood what they were doing as a fifth columnist, as a paid asset, as an influence agent of the CIA, in that particular case, or MI6. In both cases, I don't believe those two individuals were assets. They certainly, the outcomes of their actions were highly beneficial to U.S. policy, as first the Bush and then the Clinton administration were able to capitalize. In their circles around them were their particular foreign agency assets. I think so. how influential those influences were in the outcomes. Hard for me to say. Case by case is different. And then you have to ask yourself case by case, and that's what I've been doing for years. When you look at why did Gorbachev fail to deal more constructively, realistically with the no-inch eastward promise? Why did Gorbachev agree to withdraw the Soviet forces from Germany without a parallel withdrawal of the US from Germany? When you ask those questions and you look at how the decisions were made, you're looking for the answer to your question. Was the guy colossally stupid? And then you can ask the same questions of the Yeltsin period, but you can ask the same questions of the Indian leadership. Why did Prime Minister Modi go to the Israeli parliament 48 hours before war and scream, "Am Yisrael Chai"? Why did India make such a colossal mistake as to put its future on the line with the Israeli and American attack on Iran? Why did he do that? Okay. And then you could ask similar questions of President Xi, and you can ask those questions of lots of folks who are in political leadership of the war-fighting world we're in. You don't have to have, pardon me, CIA or Mossad or MI6 agents actively at work inside the decision-making circle. It certainly helps if you do, but it would vary from country to country, politics to politics, circle to circle. So I can wind up by saying the decisions Gorbachev and Yeltsin made were gifts to the United States, a terrible loss to Russia, terrible loss from which Russia is still trying to recover. Did you need CIA agents to achieve that outcome? No, you didn't just need them there. They were around, but the outcome was Gorbachev's failures, Yeltsin's failures, and some of Yeltsin's failures are still in power in Moscow and still wish to be loved by the United States for their own personal enrichment. That's still an argument of who they are and how to neutralize their influence going forward. Politics is also about conspiracies, some successful, some not.
Thank you so much, Mr. Helmer, for joining me on this episode of the Red Pill Diaries. I got to get you back here soon because I want to talk to you about that Indian dynamic, because I've been talking about that for a while, since they betrayed Iran, and maybe I can have you back on soon. I'll send you a copy of the show in a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Rashid. Look forward to coming back.
And be blessed. Be safe. Everybody listen. As we go off, I always say this, and I say this ad nauseum, but I have to say it. Do right to others, not because there's some material gain to be had, but do right by others because it's the right, the humane, and the godly thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching you, remember that God Almighty is watching you. As my late, great, and beautiful mother would always say, God sits high on the throne of power, but he looks low at the actions of man. Know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, remember, stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. We're out of here.